Chapter 9, Section 3 of the Americans, the Progressive Era. Chapter 9, Section 3 is entitled Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal. The main idea of this section is, as president, Theodore Roosevelt worked to give citizens a square deal through progressive reforms. Chapter 9, Section 3 begins with the story of the muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair, who wrote a very important novel called The Jungle that described the conditions that working men faced in the meat factories in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. This book would be so widely read and so influential that even President Theodore Roosevelt would be moved to create new laws because of it. President Theodore Roosevelt is a major focus of this chapter because as president he was one of the most active progressive leaders the United States has ever seen. He fought to curb the power of major businesses and industrialization, and he also sought to help the common man by ensuring fair competition in the capitalist marketplace. His presidency was a model to later presidents because of his dynamic leadership and rugged individualism. He truly was a modern heroic figure. Later presidents have all tried to be like Theodore Roosevelt in using the presidency as a bully pulpit, which is the word that describes how the president can direct the attention of a nation on causes and issues that the president thinks are important. With the people's attention focused upon what the president wants, the president can get the people to pressure Congress to pass laws dealing with those issues. The bully in the bully pulpit is the president using the people to bully Congress into doing what it wants. One of the ways that President Roosevelt used his presidency and his bully pulpit was in expanding federal power to break up the trusts of the major industrial corporations. By breaking up trusts like Standard Oil, President Roosevelt allowed for greater independence and competition in the American marketplace. In addition to breaking up trusts, Roosevelt also got involved in labor disputes, acting as a third-party mediator in disputes between the owners and the workers. The 1902 coal strike is a good example of this. He helped to negotiate a 10% pay hike and a shorter 9-hour workday for the unions. Theodore Roosevelt also got involved in railroad regulation. Railroad regulation allowed the government to break up the control of farmers by the railroads by giving it authority to regulate interstate trade. You'll read about the Interstate Commerce Act, the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the Hepburn Act, which all allowed for greater control over the railroads by the government. After reading The Jungle, Roosevelt sought to increase inspection of the country's meat industry, the notoriously dirty and corrupt industry. He got the Meat Inspection Act passed that increased the number of government inspectors in meat factories and throughout the meat distribution system. The idea was to stop unseen dangers like E. coli and other mad cow diseases from infecting the American people. The continuation of E. coli outbreaks and mad cow disease in American food today requires that we ask ourselves just how effective the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 really is. In addition to passing laws that tried to increase public safety in food, Theodore Roosevelt also pushed through the Pure Food and Drug Act, which tried to create some standards for medicines in the United States. The Pure Food and Drug Act tried to halt the sale of contaminated medicines and called for truth in labeling. The problem was that many Americans would buy medicine at their local pharmacist, take it home and consume it, not knowing if it would actually cause more problems or even kill them. Theodore Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman and enjoyed hiking throughout the United States. He also was the first president to create a massive new national park system, setting aside millions of acres of untouched native forests and other national treasures. Theodore Roosevelt also had a progressive view when it came to civil rights in the United States. And on page 324, you'll read a section that discusses all of the efforts he took to improve the lives of African Americans, even going so far as inviting Booker T. Washington to join him at dinner at the White House. After news of a white president sitting down with an African American leader was leaked to the public, there was a national outrage over this dinner. On page 325, you'll see a list of terms and names for this section. Please add these names to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards. Take a moment to read carefully the section on page 326 and 327 in your textbook that details the accomplishments of the muckrakers. This effort by journalists to reveal the anti-competitive actions of big business is essential to understanding American history. Chapter 9, Section 4 is entitled Progressivism under Taft. The main idea of this section is that Taft's ambivalent approach to progressive reform led to a split in the Republican Party and the loss of the presidency to the Democrats. And when Taft became president, he took up the same progressive reform agenda that Theodore Roosevelt had been so successful with. However, he did not please Theodore Roosevelt and the other progressives because he was not as outgoing and outrageous as Theodore Roosevelt. He did not use the presidency as a bully pulpit, instead pursuing more compromise and private negotiation. This made progressive followers less pleased than they had been with Theodore Roosevelt, even though Taft actually broke up more trusts in his 4 years as president. At the bottom of page 329, you'll read about how the Republican Party splits in the election of 1912. When Theodore Roosevelt returns to the United States after spending many years traveling in Europe and in Africa, he then begins his own political party called the Bull Moose Party to try and retake the presidency because he was dissatisfied with the progressive reforms attempted by William Howard Taft. The election of 1912 is detailed on page 330, where you'll read about Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party proposing a new nationalism under which the federal government would exert its power for the welfare of the people. The Bull Moose Party split the vote of the Republican Party between William Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. This essentially allowed Woodrow Wilson, the former president of Princeton University and the governor of New Jersey, to win the election of 1912. William Howard Taft served as president for just one term, but afterwards became the only president to ever go on to serve in the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. On page 331, you'll see the presidential election map for the election of 1912, showing how in California the vote was split between Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. The idea that a state could split its electoral votes in an election is a direct result of the progressive movement. At the bottom of page 331, you'll see a list of terms and names for this section. Please add them to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards. Chapter 9, Section 5 is entitled Wilson's New Freedom. The main idea of this section is that Woodrow Wilson established a strong reform agenda as a progressive leader. It's important to remember that even though Woodrow Wilson came from a different political party than the previous progressive presidents of Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, all three presidents are considered progressive because they tried to change the way government operated. Woodrow Wilson came out of Princeton University and had formerly been the governor of New Jersey. He came into the presidency with the idea that he would reform the nation's financial system rather than focusing primarily on big business and railroads. As a progressive leader, Woodrow Wilson pushed through his first law, the Clayton Antitrust Act, in 1914, trying to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act hadn't been very strong, and it required a very strong president, Theodore Roosevelt, to make it actually work in America. With the Clayton Antitrust Act, labor unions and farm organizations had the right to exist and could argue for collective bargaining, could picket peacefully, could boycott, and even go on strike legally. Prior to 1914, all of these actions would have been illegal and would have allowed for businesses to call out the police to arrest, beat, and even kill striking workers. Woodrow Wilson also established the Federal Trade Commission. This was an agency given the power to investigate any violation of regulations. With this increase in government regulation in the economy, we have to understand that today this is exactly the opposite of what most Americans are experiencing. Throughout the country, businesses are being deregulated and unions are being given less and less opportunity to negotiate, to picket, to boycott, and to go on strike. Please take careful note of this box here that describes the now and then of deregulation. Woodrow Wilson also increased the power of government by establishing a new tax system. In order to curb the power of big business, he wanted to lower tariffs, and he also wanted to put into place a progressive tax system. Woodrow Wilson's tax system is detailed on page 334, where you'll read about how taxes were higher for people who earned more money, and taxes were lower for people who earned less. And in some cases, the poorest people paid no taxes at all. In addition to his federal income tax, Woodrow Wilson also created the Federal Reserve System with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. He divided the nation into 12 districts, and each district had a central bank. These were banks owned by private banks, who then served all the banks in that district. In addition to be given the power to control banking on a local level, private banks were also given the ability to issue new paper currency, and member banks could then use that currency to make loans to other banks. Woodrow Wilson's presidency also saw women win suffrage, and you'll read about it here on page 334 and continuing on to 335. It's an amazing achievement that women were able to force the federal government to stop blocking their calls for the right to vote. Woodrow Wilson himself tried very hard to stop women from being able to vote, but even he couldn't. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the right to vote. Ultimately, Woodrow Wilson's progressive administration failed in many ways to see progressive reforms take place in the United States. And at the end of chapter 9, you'll read under the Twilight of Progressivism how Woodrow Wilson used World War I as an excuse for why he could not achieve progressive reforms. Chapter 9 ends on page 337 with a list of vocabulary terms and names. Please add these terms to your growing list of vocabulary flashcards.